Well, so here we are sitting in leafy, sunny Paderborn, and I'm talking to Lisa Shapiro, who's come all the way from Frazer University, Vancouver. And she's here being awarded the Elisabeth of Bohemia and Herford Ulrika Detmers Prize. So, first of all, Lisa, many congratulations on the award of this prize.
Thank you.
And this prize is donated for work on Elisabeth of Bohemia, also known as Elisabeth von der Pfalz. And I'm wondering, what led you to work on Elisabeth?
So first, let me say how delighted I am to have been awarded this prize. It's a real honor. I became interested in Elisabeth when I was working on my dissertation on Descartes' conception of the union of mind and body as understood through the passions of the soul. And Descartes' correspondence with Elisabeth is very important for understanding what Descartes is up to for two reasons. One, Elisabeth, in the 1643 letters of their correspondence, challenges Descartes' account of the union of mind and body, and in particular, his account of the way the mind can move the body. And Descartes doesn't particularly have satisfactory answers to her. Their correspondence continues, but really gets going again in 1645, when they begin to talk about Seneca and Elisabeth's own struggles with her own melancholy and sadness, not unrelated to the events of the English Civil War. She asked Descartes to write the Treatise on the Passions. So Descartes' drafting of the Treatise of the Passions results directly from a query of Elisabeth. So I was reading these letters of Descartes first, and then it occurred to me that perhaps I should read the other side of the correspondence for the 1645 letters, as well as the 1643 letters. And as I was reading the correspondence, as a conversation between two individuals, it became very clear that Elisabeth was very sharp and very astute in her criticisms of Descartes. And so I started to spend more time on the correspondence itself, and with every reading, it becomes clear just how rich the correspondence is.
Well, one of your great contributions has been to translate that correspondence into English. And as a result, many people in the English-speaking world are able to read it who couldn't read it before. So it's been a very valuable tool for philosophers who want to find out about Elisabeth, or indeed have more insight into this correspondence, which has typically been read from Descartes' point of view and often only through Descartes' letters. So I'm wondering what led you to actually decide to translate it.
So there's a lovely livre de poche edition in French, edited by Jean-Marie Bessade, who is no longer with us, who is an incredible scholar of Descartes and Cartesianism. And I was using that French edition to be able to read the correspondence seamlessly without having to flip around in the Œuvre de Descartes. And it occurred to me that I'm going to need to translate this for my dissertation, which was written in English. And I started to look to see if there were any existing English translations. And there was one that was out of print, and that was did not do justice. The translation itself did not do justice to the correspondence. I think Descartes' letters to Elisabeth, with the exception of one, had been translated quite well by Cottingham, Studhoff, Murdoch, and Kenny. And so there wasn't really a need for the Descartes translation, but there was a real need for the Elisabeth side of it. And I just thought, well, I've got to start translating these letters, and anyway, for my own professional purposes. And it occurred to me that it would be, I think, just a service to humanity to have a translation that would be readily accessible, and that would, I think, change the way the correspondence itself was read. One of the interesting things about philosophers is we're pretty flat-footed in terms of thinking about genres of writing. And while philosophers turn to Descartes' correspondence to get insight into possible interpretations of his printed philosophical works, they didn't think of a correspondence as a kind of dialogic production of philosophy itself. And the correspondence with Elisabeth is very much that. Moreover, I guess, so it's about an art of reading, promoting a certain art of reading. You get, I think, a very different read of Descartes' letters by reading the correspondence as a whole, rather than reading Descartes' letters in isolation. And then for Elisabeth, having her translation of her letters be more widely accessible to non-expert French, non-fluent French people who weren't fluent in French, would, I think, help to bring out just how astute she is philosophically. One of the questions that comes up when you read Elisabeth's side of the correspondence is whether she's being simply responsive to Descartes and doing nothing but taking up a skeptical attitude and raising objections, or whether there's some kind of systematic unity or development of a view in her own side of the correspondence. And I was trying to figure that out. I think it was a real interpretive question as to what was going on. And I think in many cases, certainly with respect to the nature of the mind-body union, she is working her way towards a kind of view that she herself wants to hold that is aligned with certain aspects of Descartes' view. I think she's very sympathetic to his account of the nature of thought as involving a kind of autonomy and an exercise of will and subjectivity in thinking. But what she was really struggling to work out was whether there was a way to preserve that aspect of thought while not postulating a kind of mysterious immaterial mind that didn't have explanatory traction. So she wanted to see whether it could be possible to have a materialist account of mind while preserving the subjectivity of thought in Descartes' account. And those 1643 letters, I think, express that kind of effort to thread the needle, as it were, in that trying to get that position just right. And in the course of doing that, she presses Descartes on the intelligibility of his own account of his own dualism, his own metaphysical dualism, and whether it can account for the nature of a human being, first of all. And secondly, as he tries to answer her question, she takes no prisoners. She doesn't let him get away with a sloppy answer and calls him on internal inconsistencies in his own view. So she's clearly read Descartes, thought about it, and understands it in a way that she can hold him accountable for consistency. And it's also interesting to see how his respect for her really develops in just those three letters. That the beginning, I think he treats her as a student who's smart, but not as smart as he is. And by the third letter, it's clear he has a deeper respect for her acumen, her philosophical acumen. The later letters are interesting because, again, It's not clear what her positive view is. Her letters are much more succinct than Descartes' letters. She makes points in very short passages, and many of the points are critical of Descartes' own view, that his own ethics that he's actually developing in his letters to her, and raising quite astute points of view, quite astute objections to the view that Descartes' outlining. What's less clear is whether there's some coherence in the objections that she's advancing. I have argued that there is some coherence there, that she's got an account of virtue that's more Aristotelian than Descartes', that Descartes takes virtue to be, it's a very internalist conception of virtue. In some ways, it's a good thing for him that virtue is easy, that to be virtuous we need to judge the best we can and act on those best judgments. But as Elisabeth points out, that sometimes we can judge the best we can and act on those best judgments and still have things turn out quite badly. And so just the accidents of the world can interfere with our actually doing good things. At the same time, her view doesn't seem to be a simple regurgitation of Aristotle. It's Aristotelian in spirit. It's less Aristotelian insofar as she situates her objections within the context of political decision-making. It's clear that she takes her role as a princess who could potentially have responsibilities for governing seriously, and the ways in which our judgments can go wrong have to do with the way our judgments affect other people whose lives depend on our decisions. And so there's a political dimension to her thought as well. What's not clear, and what I think she's probably wrestling with personally, the philosophical point is a personal one for her, is what's required to govern well. What is it to be a good political leader? And equally, what's the best method for making political decisions under conditions of imperfect knowledge, which is a standard philosophical question. There are hints of a kind of rational choice theory that sometimes different competing goods have to be balanced against each other in some way, but it's not worked out. What I would be really, I think we're hampered in many ways of understanding her view because of the limited nature of her philosophical writings that we know of. We know of state papers, that letters she wrote in relation to her to the restoration of the crown, the monarchy in England after the Civil War. I should say her family history is sort of interesting, which adds context to it. Her mother was the daughter of Charles I of England, James I of England, and yes, her uncle was Charles I of England, and Charles I was, of course, beheaded as part of the English Civil War, and that was incredibly disturbing to the family fortunes. Her father was Frederick V of Bohemia, who is also known as the Winter King, and whose ill-fated battles led to the beginning of the 30 Years' War. And so her family was positioned at the center of European politics from the beginning of her life, her birth in 1618. And as a result, they were profoundly involved in negotiating the end of the 30 Years' War and the restoration of the monarchy in England. And there's correspondence. She serves as her family's agent, corresponding with some of the royalists in the English Civil War. We know of those correspondences. We know of correspondence she had with mathematicians like John Pell in England. We know of correspondence that she has with Quakers when she was abbess at the convent at Herford, not far from here in Paderborn. And but we don't know, those are not very philosophically rich. And it would be, we know she met Malebranche. We know of one letter that used to exist with Malebranche that's referred to by Robinet's Œuvre de Malebranche, but that doesn't contain the text of the letter itself. We know she knew Leibniz. Her youngest sister, Sophie, was the patron of Leibniz, who tutored her niece, Sophie Charlotte.
Yes.
And we know she had interactions with Francis Mercury von Helmont, the Paracelsian, who also had interactions with Anne Conway. But that suggests there should be more philosophical correspondence. But we don't know where that correspondence might be, or where, or if it's been destroyed. It would be lovely to discover any additional writings, because she's. I'm sure those letters, if they exist, still would be incredibly rich and would lend insight to filling out the whole picture of her own philosophical views, which what we have of them right now are responsive to Descartes. So,
well, this is one of the very frustrating things about working on early modern women philosophers, that very often there are not enough sources, or gaps in the sources, so that leads to the obvious question: is if there's not enough there, how can we place her as a philosopher? I mean, she's obviously got a place in the Descartes, the context of Descartes, but everything you're saying, the insights that you just showed, the wonderful insights these letters bring into her, makes her a hugely interesting figure. So this is a big question for doing history of philosophy.
That's a great question, actually. I think, it might be that we're left simply speculating about Elisabeth's philosophical views. As I said at the beginning, though, I think one of the challenges of working on early modern women is that there is not a large body, there are not centuries of secondary literature to help guide interpretation. And so the first thing I would say is to not assume we have the full story. I think rereading with additional, not philosophical context, but historical context can lend a kind of texture and richness to and additional insights into the arguments that might be being made. I think if all we ever have is the correspondence with Descartes, our conclusions are going to have to be of necessity limited. But at the same time, that doesn't diminish Elisabeth as a philosopher. In fact, she certainly merits a very prominent place because of her clear causal influence on Descartes' own views. And Descartes is certainly a prominent figure in the history of philosophy. And I don't think I think the causal connection is incontrovertible there, which makes her an important figure in her own right. But I also think the speculative understanding of her own whole philosophical view points to a kind of shift in the way of thinking about what it is to do history of philosophy. We tend to think of history of philosophy as great works by great minds. And so what we have to do is master the great works. But that's not how philosophy actually works. It might be that great works do get produced, but they don't get produced in isolation. They get produced through conversations and exchanges of ideas, and it's important to recognize that dynamic. And Elisabeth was quite a famous, she had a reputation in her own time, and whether we can establish direct relations between her and her contemporaries or later philosophical figures, I think there's certainly a case to be made that she was influential on the views not simply of Descartes, but of others, and was part of an intellectual network. In fact, Carol Powell has a wonderful book, the Republic of Women in the Republic of Letters, in which she actually has done the work to show in the historical context that Elisabeth did interact with a whole set of women thinkers in The Hague at her mother's court and at Herford where she was abbess. And that just shows how rich the intellectual life of women in the period were, and how we need to do more. We don't have a lot of information because people haven't been looking for things in archives. And philosophers and historians and literary historians, I think, need to be collaborating to share information and learn from one another so that we can all understand the intellectual historical context and the philosophy that emerges in that historical context with more depth. But it's an exciting time because there are things to be discovered, and archives, especially of manuscript material, are far from completely inventoried, and there are things to be found, and people don't know what's there in full. We know some of what's there, but hardly all of it. So it takes time to find things. It takes time to read things once they're found, to decipher handwriting, and and to situate in its proper context.
Lisa, it's been a pleasure to talk to you about a subject which both of us love so much. So thank you very, very much.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I love talking about Elisabeth.
Yes.
Ta-da! Ta-da! That wasn't so awful, was it?
That was wonderful.